بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح، نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلي اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah. Kitab al-Salah. So Sidi Abdul Wahid ibn Ashir, rahimahullah ta'ala, brings us into the section of Salah. And Salah, or prayer in Arabic, the actual term Salah was used early on amongst the Arab to just mean dua, or supplication. As al-Qadi Iyad, for example, says that the concept of Salah meaning dua was actually well known in terms of the language of the Arabs. And so, salah meaning dua, supplication, is the way in which this concept was first understood, and then the term was reappropriated later to mean the formal prayer. And as you'll find, a lot of the religious terminology that's used in Islam was reappropriated after the da'wah to mean something else. Some of the linguists also say that it could come from sila, so the connection, right, that one makes between two things. So in this particular instance, it would be the sila bayn al-abdi wa rabbihi. It's the connection between the servant and his Lord. So it's the connection that we make as human beings to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And salah, formally, as it is come to be known, is the actual Muslim prayer, right, that was initiated by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the first line here, he says, فَرَائِضُ الصَّلَاةِ سِتَّ عَشَرَ شُرُوطُهَا أَرْبَعَةٌ مُفْتَخِرَةٌ. The obligations of prayer are 16, and its necessary conditions are 4. So we're going to go through those, but it is imperative that first we understand the difference between the obligations and conditions. So what is a fard and what is a shart? A fard is an obligation which is rewarded when it's fulfilled, and it deserves punishment for not fulfilling it. And they say that it is intrinsic to the act, or it is within the essence of the act itself. Whereas a shart is that whose presence is necessary either for the obligation or validity of an act. Even though, and this is one of the caveats they put, even though its presence alone does not indicate the validity. Why? Well, because there can be more than just one condition, right? So a shart sihha, condition of validity, is, for example, that I have tahara, purification from both khabath and hadath, as we talked about in the previous section. So I could have that, but I'm not facing the qibla, for example, right? So it's not that in and of itself is going to be sufficient. And then there's also what is known as a shart wujub, okay? A shart wujub, which is a condition for the obligation itself. For example, you could say that I'm a mukallaf, right? I'm morally culpable in front of the Sharia in order to actually perform these acts. Or that I have milkiyah on my annual savings to pay zakat. Like I have full ownership over my earnings in order for me to be able then to pay the zakat. So he firstly will go through these obligations, which are 16, and then he goes through the necessary conditions. If you're going through the text that Sheikh Hamza, Hafidhahullah, put together, he actually starts with the conditions first, and then he goes to the obligations. But in the original text, it begins with the obligations and then goes to the conditions. So, depending on what you're following with, you may have to go forward a little bit and then we'll go back. So, فرائض الصلاة, the obligations of prayer. He says, تكبيرة الإحرام والقيام لها ونية بها ترام. The obligations are the opening takbir, the takbirat al-ihram, which is audible. So, Allahu Akbar. And that's all you say. It's just Allahu Akbar in Arabic, according to the dominant opinion. And this indicates the entering into a sanctified state, which is called hurma or ihram. And it's called that because, as you know, the term haram, right, which is impermissibility or something that's unlawful, meaning that when you enter into a sacred state, there are certain things that are now haram that are not haram outside of that state, one can say. So the person that's praying, for example, is not to be accosted. This same term, when it was used to describe or indicate a woman, when we called a woman hurma, for example, comes from the same concept that women generally in society were not the type of people that anyone could just go and speak to. It's very important people, right? There are certain people in society that you can't just go up and start talking to the president or like the queen or the king or something like that. There are, certain people that are seen as sanctified in that sense, from a societal sense. And so that is actually where the term, as it indicates women in society, comes from. And today, obviously, that term has changed. You'll find in the Arabic language, for example, many women who take offense to you calling them that. But it's important to understand where these terms actually derive from. It's a very beautiful concept too. So that's the takbirat al-ihram. وَالْقِيَامُ لَهَا, and standing during the takbir. So as you'll come to see, the standing during the takbir is going to be seen as separate than the standing for the Fatiha, as we'll get to in a second here. So this is standing for the takbir itself. And then the niyyah, intention, and this is to be done at the outset. And it's also not to be announced, right? It's something that's in the heart. That, they say that محل النية القلب, the domain of one's intention is in the heart. And so one should be making the specific intention for the prayer that they're going to pray. In particular, whether or not this is a prayer that's being done on time, in distinction to one that is going to be done as a makeup prayer, okay, adat and qada, and we'll talk more about that later. Or if you're intending to pray the traveler's prayer, that has to be intended specifically, and all of the entailments then from that. And then he says, فاتحة مع القيام والركوع والرفع منه والسجود بالخضوع. The recitation of the Fatiha, and the Malikis begin immediately after the takbir. So, you Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, right? There's no A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem. There's no Basmala in the beginning. They don't do a dua al-istiftah like the other madhhab do. So, you just go straight from the takbir into Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as was seen as the first verse according to Imam Malik. Now, unless you're trying to do like Mura'at al-Khilaf, for example, where you're mitigating the differences, right, amongst the different madhahib, and you're in a particular scenario where you know that doing something like that is going to cause some problems. I actually was in a scenario like this once where I went to go give a khutbah at a local community, and then, in leading the prayer, I led the prayer and takbirat al-ihram and went straight into Fatiha. And someone came up to me afterwards and they were like really upset. This is a predominantly Hanafi crowd, and so he came up to me and he said, "You didn't give me time to make my dua al-istiftah." And I said, I didn't get into there's differences of opinion and all of these things. I just said, you know what, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. And he said, no, you don't understand. You didn't give me time to make my dua al-istiftah. Right? It's like a big deal, And so, these things matter. And so you have to be cognizant of the communities. And that's why mitigating differences in the Mālikī madhhab is actually seen as like a imperative. Now, even though obviously there's complete agreement amongst the schools from a very early point in the development of these schools, that each school is merited. Like each school and their opinions are seen as valid opinions, and that praying behind anyone from one of those schools is completely valid, even if it may be different than the way in which you pray, right? So, Allahu A'lam, but it's good to be cognizant of these things as well. So then he says, Fatihatun ma'al qiyam. Okay, so the Fatiha is one, and then the standing for the Fatiha is another obligation. Wal ruku', and then the bowing, right? And The bowing is where you bow, you try to keep the back perpendicular, kind of like this, okay, with the legs slightly bended. They shouldn't be straight. Should have a slight bend in them. وَالرَّفْعُ مِنْهُ, and then rising from it, and then sujood in humility. And ideally, in your sujood, your forehead and your nose, your two palms, your knees and your toes all should be touching the floor. And then he says, وَالرَّفْعُ مِنْهُ وَالسَّلَامُ وَالْجُلُوسِ لَهُ وَتَرْتِيبُ أَدَاءٍ فِي الْأُسُوسِ. Rising from the prostration, saying the final salam audibly, right? And then sitting for the final salam, and their performance being done in the proper sequence of the foundational obligations. وَالْاِعْتِدَالُ مُطْمَئِنًّا بِالْتِزَامِ تَابَعَ مَأْمُومٌ بِإِحْرَامٍ سَلَامٍ. And then standing fully erect, and then maintaining composure at points of stillness throughout the prayer. So there needs to be a moment of stillness in each point of the prayer. So, a moment of stillness in your qiyam, a moment of stillness in your ruku', a moment of stillness when you come up from the ruku', and so on. And this is very important in the madhhab. مطمئنا بالتزام تابع مأموم. So following the imam in the audible takbir of ihram and the salam. And, it's also well known that if you do your takbir al-ihram or say your salam before the imam has, then your prayer is rendered invalid, right? So this is something to watch out for. As a general rule too, just, a really helpful piece of information. Things that are vocalized in the madhhab are not obligatory except for three things: Takbirat al-Ihram, the Fatiha, and the final salam. Alright? And all movements in the prayer are obligatory except three: raising the hands for Takbirat al-Ihram, the middle julus, and then the turning of the head to the right for the salam. So just something that is good for you to know in terms of navigating the madhhab. نيته اقتداء كذا الإمام في خوف وجمع جمعة مستخلف. So one is obliged to fix one's intention of following the imam, so you have to intend the prayer as a follower. Likewise, the imam must intend to lead others in the fear prayer when joining due to rain, the Jum'ah prayer, and when replacing an imam who, for whatever reason, must quit leading the actual prayer that he's performing. And so, the imam generally doesn't need intention except in the following prayers: the fear prayer, which is a special type of prayer where groups take turns, usually done in battles or other special ops; doing a jam'ah, which is joining of the prayers, so in the rain, darkness, or there's no moonlight, for example, so you can't see, or on roads that are difficult to travel by, so you're allowed then to do a jam'ah prayer. And istikhlaf is when the imam needs to leave the prayer for whatever reason. So like if they were to get a bloody nose during the middle of the prayer, or they lose their wudu for whatever reason. So the person who replaces him needs to make intention to lead. So those are the obligations of the prayer. Any questions about that? So then he goes on to the conditions of the prayer. شرطها الاستقبال طهر الخبث وستر عورة وطهر الحدث. The conditions of performance of prayer are 4. Facing the qibla, which is istiqbal al-qibla. Now, there's a lot of discussion on this that I think is extremely relevant for our day and age. First of all, in the Haram al-Makki, okay, when you're actually in the Haram al-Makki, you can visibly see the Kaaba. You have to face directly towards the Qibla, what's known as Ayn al-Qibla. If one is outside of the Haram, then you're obligated only to face the direction of the Qibla, which is known as Jihat al-Qibla. This is very important to understand and to distinguish. Now, Jihat al-Qibla, what that means, so if the 4 cardinal directions are north, south, east, and west, What that means is that you remain within a 45-degree range either way of the qibla. And that's all that can be expected of someone in that case. Now, there's a difference of opinion in the Shafi'i madhhab. We're not going to go into all of that. But this is, the Mālikī position. Now, some mentioned also that the qibla of the major Muslim cities, especially where the companions of the Prophet himself ﷺ were involved, those also must be followed. So, Medina, okay, you're not going to go into the Masjid al-Nabawi and, regulate for yourself what the qibla is. No, the qibla is known in the masjid. The masajid that are in Sham, the masajid that are in Egypt, for example, that are known in that way, those must be followed. Other than that, the ulama say that one is obligated to make ijtihad, to make their best effort with what one has. Now, this can be a variety of things. So you can have a compass. You can do it on the basis of sun shadows, on the moon, the stars, the winds even. Now, the big question and the most contentious one is, what directional method does one follow? Right? Particularly when they're not in one of these specific locations, like in the Middle East or whatnot. And the issue has been particularly problematic in North America. This is well known for those of you who experienced this in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I didn't really experience it. I heard about it more or less from family members. But, the issue, and it comes up still every now and then. Do you follow the Great Circle route, which gives you the shortest distance between 2 points on the surface of a sphere? Right? So like when you fly from Los Angeles to Mecca, you're actually flying north-northeast. But if you look at a two-dimensional map, Mecca is east, slightly southeast from Los Angeles, right? So tracing it as a straight line, the qibla would actually just be east or slightly southeast. So which one do you follow? Do you follow the Great Circle route, or do you follow the straight line? Caused a lot of problems and still will kind of creep up, as fitan do from time to time, and like create a lot of buzz and chaos and whatnot in the community. Now, look, my opinion on this and that of my teachers is either one is fine. And it should never be an issue that people are divisive about. Like, that's the point. It's an ijtihadi issue. The classical texts discuss the qibla that's outside of the haram as a jihah and base their understanding of that on very simple, practical derivations. Like the Prophet ﷺ said to the community in Medina, مَا بَيْنَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ قِبْلَةً. Anything between east and west is the qibla. Like, just pray south, basically, is what he was telling them. And that was taken by some of the early jurists to imply that the qibla for anything north of Mecca was south. Even in places that were like far east or west of the meridian of Mecca. Like, for example, there are certain masajid in Andalusia or in Central Asia that just point south. And, sometimes when people go there and they see these things, they can't really believe it. And this is what caused a lot of the chaos in the revisionist literature that was written about, Islam and the origins of Islam and these things, right, from Patricia Crona. It was just absurdity because they didn't understand these points of fiqh, right? Now, the same goes for places to the east of Mecca and places to the west. So, like, anything east of Mecca was to face west, and the western regions face east. And this is what the great imams said about this, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, all of them. Now, there were other considerations as well, particularly from the earliest masajid built by the companions themselves that show the qibla facing, for example, the rising or setting of a particular star, or the sun at the equinoxes, etc. Because the stars rise and set at fixed points on the horizon in any given area. So, for example, the qibla in Syria faces towards the star Suhail, which in English is Canopus. It's one of the brightest stars in the cosmos. The qibla in Yemen actually faces the pole star, right? So, now they also knew that at the equinoxes, sunrise and sunset are what will define east and west. So, for example, in Northwest Africa, the Qibla faces the rising of the sun at the equinoxes, which is due east. And they also knew that at the solstices, sunrise and sunset are 30 degrees north or south. So, north in the middle of summer and then south in the middle of winter. So, for example, the first mosque that was built in Egypt faces winter sunrise. And in Iraq, you have masajid that face winter sunset. You see what I'm saying? So, these are all slight variations. And obviously, they show that there's differences. And the jurists themselves differed on this point. In Central Asia, you have masajid that face south. You have masajid that face towards the winter sunset. Some due west, etc. And all are actually in the same locality. So, that's the point here. These aren't simplistic derivations that were made by some of these ulama. So what do we follow in North America? Well, the fatwa that came from Azhar in the 90s, not everybody agreed on that fatwa. We know that the spherical trajectory would entail that Mecca from North America is northeast. And that isn't simply a derivation that modernists who are enamored with science and a post-colonial mindset posited. Okay, there's real substance to this argument. And you can look at the details of this argument. I don't actually want to get into all of it right now, but Sheikh Nuh Keller, in his book Port in a Storm, goes through all of this. And so you can look at the details of this argument, and he actually shows that there's a lot of weight to the position that you should be praying northeast in North America. So my opinion, and Allahu A'lam, anyone you follow is fine. Okay, there's ijtihad for both opinions. There's an ijtihad for, facing east from North America. There's an ijtihad for facing northeast. Allahu A'lam. I prefer not to make a big deal out of it. I know it's a sensitive issue. Most masajid in North America face northeast. And, even those who, like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, for example, said that his position when he's in North America is that it should be east. Most Mauritanian scholars, as a matter of fact, are going to hold that opinion, at least the ones that I've been in contact with. But even Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, said that if he's at a masjid and that masjid is praying northeast, because so many of the masajid, if not the majority of masajid in North America, all face northeast, he would himself pray with the jama'ah. So it's not like this is an issue for him in which he wouldn't pray with the jama'ah. I would rather pray with the jama'ah, right? And so that becomes the crux for me to think about. It definitely should not be a point of divisiveness in the community to that extent. But both opinions are strong opinions. Both have strong antecedents in the tradition. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Okay, so that's that. Lastly, what do you do if you don't know what the qibla is at all? For some reason, your phone dies, right? Which is where most of us are deriving this anyways. Your phone dies, you're in the middle of nowhere, you have no idea, what's north, what's south, what's any of this. What do? The Malikis have two opinions on this. The first one they said was that you pray in all four directions. You're bound to hit one of them, right? The second opinion is that you just choose one direction, it's your best guess, and that's sufficient. So then he says, Tuhrul khabathi. So being free from physical impurities. So these are, this is the second condition. And this is in particular within three places. Now this is also one of the two mashhur opinions. The other opinion is that being free from physical impurity is a sunnah in a darura situation. So this is also an important point to make. Being free of physical impurities, khabath, in three places. The first is on your physical body, okay, your skin and hair. The second is your clothes, and third, the place of your prayer, so where your body will touch on prostration itself has to be free from physical impurities. Now, for one who deals with najasa often, it's recommended for them to have a different set of clothes, for example, a butcher or a mother who's breastfeeding or new parents in general. And if they're unable to, then it's considered ma'fu'an. excused. Sorry. And this is because of the particular hardship that they're going through in this situation. Also, the one who is faqir and is unable to clean properly is also excused in this particular situation. وَسَطْرُ عَوْرَةٍ. So covering one's nakedness for both men and women. Generally, there's what's known as the عَوْرَةُ الْمُغَلَّظَةِ, which is the minimum amount that must be covered or the prayer is invalid. And then the عَوْرَةُ الْمُخَفَّفَةِ, which is generally required, but the prayer would still be valid if they weren't covered. This is coming up in the upcoming lines, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. وَطُهْرُ الْحَدَثِ. And then ritual purity, which is something that we've already covered in the first section. And this is both minor or major ritual impurity. And if there's harm or fear in obtaining water, as we talked about in our last class, then one can make tayammum. Okay. So then he says, بِالذِّكْرِ وَالْقُدْرَةِ فِي غَيْرِ الْأَخِيرِ تَفْرِيعُ نَاسِيهَا وَعَاجِزٌ كَثِيرٌ. These conditions only apply when one remembers them and has the ability to fulfill them. So these conditions only apply for the one who remembers and has the ability. Dhikr wal qudra. Except for wudu. Okay? I.e. facing the qibla, being free from impurities, and covering the awrah. So for example, if you prayed and there was najasa on your clothes and you were unaware of it, you don't have to repeat the prayer, because you entered the prayer unknowingly. And like he said earlier, you're only taking account for those things that we have a firm understanding of, not how something actually is. So we're not taking into account for something that we were unaware of. And lastly, he mentions that the variables in regards to one who forgets, be that in the middle of the prayer or after they finished or before, and the combination of that with not being able to do it are many. He doesn't actually go into it being a primer text in fiqh. Now, in the upcoming line, he says, نَدْبًا يُعِيدَانِ بِوَقْتٍ كَالْخَطَأ فِي قِبْلَةٍ لَا عَجْزِهَا أَوْ الْغِطَاء. It's recommended for both, i.e. forgetting or unable, to repeat the prayer. And this is a general principle in the Mālikī school. Anything that says يُعِيدُ فِي الْوَقْتِ, to repeat in the time, is only a recommendation. It's never going to be obligatory, because the action itself was valid. Whereas when the fuqaha say يُعِيدُ أَبَدًا, to repeat forever, that's obligatory because it connotes that the action was never actualized to begin with. Right? So as he says here, فِي قِبْلَةٍ لَا عَجْزِهَا أَوْ الْغِطَاء. You know, for example, when a mistake in determining the qibla is made, like you prayed the prayer but had the wrong qibla, even though you did your best to determine, therefore it's recommended to repeat the prayer in its time. So this concept of repetition of prayer in its time connotes a fadila, or capturing the merit of a thing over fulfilling an obligation. And there are different types that the Mālikī ulama include in this. So for example, if you prayed by yourself and then the jama'ah is about to pray the same prayer, you can join the jama'ah as a fadila, something that's meritorious. The exception to this, they say, is the maghrib prayer, because that would even out the number of rak'ahs, and you know, you're supposed to do so at the end of the night for your witr prayers, right? And so if you were to do that, if you were to pray 2 maghribs, you would actually end on an odd with your witr prayer. So, and also when we get to the section on imamah, he'll mention that the imam cannot lead the prayer of a prayer that he has already prayed, because they consider his intention as being different. And in the Mālikī school, one must have the niyyah of the imam. So the one who's prayed a prayer once already would have a different niyyah than the one trying to fulfill the obligation of the prayer. They say, you know, the imam can't be praying with the intentions of a fadila. So the imam ratib for that prayer should have the intention for that specific prayer. Right? This is also why the traveler should pray by themselves in the town that they're traveling in. And the exception is, you know, if there's a righteous person that you're going to visit, they say you should pray with that person because there's a lot of barakah in you praying, with the salihin and the awliya. And generally, the Malikis only pray the ratib in jama'ah. Like, for example, if you miss the jama'ah prayer in the masjid, unlike the other schools, you don't pray a separate jama'ah prayer. Okay, you pray by yourself. And, this is also a little bit different than what I've seen many other people practicing. And practically speaking, this actually mitigates a lot of community issues, right? Because, one community member believes that he should be the imam, and why is this guy the imam? And so he begins to form his own jama'ah constantly. Yeah, that's problematic, right? There's an imam of the masjid, and that is the imam of the masjid. And, there's a lot of emphasis on that in the madhhab. And again, on a very practical basis, that creates a kind of harmony and regularity and normativity that's going to be necessary for a healthy society. Okay. ندبا يعيدان بوقت كالخطأ في قبلة لعجزها أو الغطاء. So then he says someone unable to face the qibla is different than one who made a mistake, right? Which changes the ruling. So for example, if you're on a flight and you determine that there's no way for you to get up and face the qibla for a number of reasons, right? There could be a number of reasons given. Then you can pray in your seat in the direction that the plane is going because you can't do otherwise. You have no way out. In this scenario, there's no recommendation to repeat the prayer. Now, some people I know still do anyways, like when they arrive at their destination, they'll, repray those prayers. That's fine. And then he says, this also includes the inability to cover one's nakedness for women and men. Okay, there's no recommendations to repeat in this case either. So the recommendation to repeat the prayer is when one made a mistake in locating the qibla. So then he talks about what the awrah for men and women actually are. And so he says, وَمَا عَدَى وَجْهَ وَكَفَّ الْحُرَّةِ يَجِبُ سَطْرُهُ كَمَا فِي الْعَوْرَةِ. All but the face and hands of a free woman must be covered and is considered to be nakedness. لكن لدى كشف لصدر أو شعر أو طرف تعيد في الوقت المقر. However, in the case of the chest or the hair being exposed during the prayer or one of her limbs, then she need only repeat it within the prescribed time. So he doesn't talk about the distinction of major and minor here, but to mention it quickly, the major awrah, which is known as the awrah al-mughallazah, and the minor awrah al-mukhaffafa, would be the entire body of the woman other than her face and hands. And if you're Hanafi, according to the Hanafis, the feet are also included in that. So for the Hanafis, it would be face, hands, and feet. For us Malikis, it's just face and hands. Which shows you then that, face, hands, and feet by ijma' of the ulama is what a woman must cover. And this would also be what is required for them to cover in front of a non-mahram man, right? So someone who she could marry. The awrah al-mukhaffafa for a woman would be the hair, the shoulders, and from the elbows down to the hands, and then the knees down to and including the feet. So if those areas were exposed in the prayer, she does not have to repeat the prayer, but it's only recommended to do so. But if the other parts of the body are exposed, the awrah al-mughallazah, she would have to repeat the prayer because the prayer at that point would be deemed invalid. Now for the man, the awrah al-mukhaffafa is from and including the navel to the private parts, and from there to the knees, but not including the knees. And I know this is different. Some of the other madhhab, the knees are included. And the awrah al-mughallazah for a man is the buttocks and the front private parts. Now, there's also adab to take into consideration here, certain types of decorum. In the madhhab, for example, for men to walk around bare-shouldered or bare-chested is seen as su'adab, is bad decorum. And then there's also culture and custom that plays a role in all of this, and it's extremely important for us to think about these matters. Like, for example, in Syria, a man showing his arms is considered bad adab. In Egypt, there are certain things that are considered bad adab. In West Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, so on and so forth. And these are things that have to be considered in terms of decorum. and like our ethical and moral posture as is being cultivated in our communities. Like the whole skinny jeans thing, for me, this is an absurdity for men to be wearing skinny jeans. And wearing t-shirts and jeans to the masjid. Nowadays we see khatibs on the minbar wearing jeans and, like just some random shirt. So like all of this to me just shows a lack of adab, and again is a manifestation of the crisis of adab that so many of the ulama are discussing in the day and age that we live today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us. شرط وجوبها النقاء من الدم بقصة أو الجفوف فاعلمي. A condition of its obligations is being free from menstrual or local blood. So now he goes into the condition of obligations, the shurut wujub, okay? Being free from menstrual or local blood, which is known by the white secretion, al-qassa al-bayda, or that blood and any discharge stops. And then he says, as we've gone through already, she doesn't make those prayers up. Okay? فَلَا قَضَى أَيَّامَهُ ثُمَّ دُخُولٍ وَقْتٍ فَأَدَّهَا بِهِ حَتْمًا أَقُولُ. Thus, that she does not redress the prayers that were missed due to blood. And the other condition is that the prayer time has entered. Now, I just want to go over the prayer times because it's an extremely important concept. And in the Mālikī school, it's somewhat different. Imam Malik is the most lenient of all of the imams when it comes to prayer times. So he generally divides the prayer times into two types. There's what's known as ikhtiyari and what's known as daruri. The ikhtiyari time is what's seen as a convenience time, or the time that you're given to decide for yourself. Daruri is seen as the time where you have to pray. Like not praying is actually sinful. Now, the Quran discusses the times of prayer into periods of time. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر. Right, the male of the shams, as he's saying. In other words, movement of the sun. That is the time period in where Dhuhr and Asr are prayed. And then Ghasaq al-Layl is the time period in where Maghrib and Isha are prayed. Qur'an al-Fajr is the Subh prayer. So, as you'll come to see, those are the time periods that have been delineated. And, within those particular delineations, there are going to be a series of prayers that need to be prayed in a very specific way. Now, the best time to pray the prayers are at the early period once they come in. With the exception of Dhuhr prayer. Imam Malik delays Dhuhr for various reasons. Most of the regions who are still practicing Malikis today, like in Egypt, in the areas of Upper Egypt, Sa'id, Sudan, Morocco, Tunis, West Africa, etc., Bilad al-Shinqit, they'll typically pray Dhuhr time in the time frame that we're in now in the summer, between 2 and even 3 p.m. Right? Usually 2:30ish is the time that they'll pray this prayer. So generally the first prayer of the day is considered Dhuhr time, and they will extend it into this sort of later period. Which is really interesting when you think about the way in which traditional Muslim societies operated. I mean, many people were up before Fajr, and right after Fajr they would begin their day, and so you're really kind of moving in terms of your day, whether that's commerce or whatever it is that you do, let's say 6:30ish or so, up until 2:30, where it's designated for work. And interestingly enough, like those are the times of real barakah. Yeah, that early portion of the day is when the majority of the work that you're actually needing to get done gets done. So those of us who really want to maximize our days, we should really maximize in that early period. So, alhamdulillah. Now, Dhuhr is defined as the point where the sun reaches 1 degree past the zawal. So 1 degree past the zenith. So if you look at this diagram, and Allah bless the Rihla folks for putting this together. It's really a nice diagram for us to look at. The sun rises from the east, correct? And as it rises, it'll cast a shadow to the west as it's moving up into the sky until it reaches the zenith, where it's directly overhead. And, the Arab would say, fi kabad as-sama'. It's literally like in the middle of the sky, right? Directly overhead. Now, it's actually not directly overhead, and it's not, something that in an equatorial country and in particular times of the year, the shadow will disappear because it's directly overhead. In other geographical regions, you'll always have some leftover shadow, which is known as fate, because the sun is not going to be directly overhead, right? So that's the point, is that some places get a lot of residual shadow and some less residual shadow. It just depends on where you are in the globe and what time of year it is. But it continues to climb until it reaches, as you see here, 90 degrees overhead. And once it gets to that point, the scholars say that it is fi waqt al-istiwa, the still moment. So they didn't actually mean that. It takes the appearance that it's just sitting there, like it's stagnant, even though they knew that it's not. Now, the sun will still continue to move from that point, which will then shift the shadow from west to east. The moment that the shadow casts to the east, it's dhuhr time. And that will be 1 degree past the meridian, which is roughly 4 minutes. Like each degree is roughly 4 minutes. Now, practically speaking, you should really wait at least 20 minutes. And this is really important, by the way, for people who pray according to the times on these apps on your phone. Yeah, this is because these apps are all based on prayer schedules that are themselves based on averages within a zone of a particular geographical region. So it might actually give you the time at the early part of the geographical zone, and you're actually a bit later than that. So like your adhan on your phone goes off, and it's not actually in yet. Now we're talking only a few minutes maybe here or there, but a few minutes is important when it's the validity of a prayer time, because you have to be certain that the time is in. Like the only time that it's okay to not have certainty is if it's an overcast day. Otherwise, you need to make sure that the prayer is actually in before you pray it. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So if the shadow is decreasing, you're in the pre-meridian time. And if it's increasing, it's post-meridian. So before the dhuhr comes in, the shadow is decreasing. And after it comes in, the shadow continues to increase. Now, the shadow will continue to move until the shadow increases up until the length of the object measuring it. And once the shadow, as you can see here, did everybody see that? Once the shadow casted is the length of the object measuring it, for the Malikis, it's Asr time. There was a difference of opinion according to the Hanafis, right? But, for the Malikis, the shadow casted being the length of the object measuring it means that it's Asr time. Now, once Asr is in, that is going to be the end of ikhtiyari time for dhuhr. So, all of this time period from this point here forward until we get to Asr time is all ikhtiyari for dhuhr. Once Asr comes in, it's now daruri for one to pray dhuhr. We're now in daruri time for dhuhr. So if you haven't prayed dhuhr, you have to stop whatever you're doing and pray it. If you delayed dhuhr to this time for no reason, like it was just out of laziness or procrastinating or whatever, you kept saying, I'm going to do it after this commercial or after this thing or after the, at the halftime, I'm going to get up and do it or I'm going to play this game. All of that is extremely problematic. Okay, it's considered a sin for you to delay dhuhr for those reasons, and you need to make tawbah for that. But if there are legitimate reasons, and those things can be that you're moving about, there are certain facets in terms of the day that necessitated that you could not get out of it or whatever the case may be. And so, that would be seen as being okay. Again, you should try to make a point of praying this prayer at the designated time that it comes in. So praying dhuhr in this Asr period, though, the point is that praying dhuhr in this Asr period is still seen as being adat. Like you're still praying it in time. As a matter of fact, the daruri time for dhuhr, continues all the way up until the end of asr. So praying dhuhr in this asr period until the sun sets is all daruri in the madhhab. This throws people off when they hear this for the first time. But in other words, you wouldn't be praying qada. You're not making up the prayer. You're still praying dhuhr on time. You're not making up dhuhr. Now the Malikis would also say that these two prayers, dhuhr and asr, go hand in hand at a certain level. So as long as you've prayed dhuhr in the asr prayer time with one rak'ah of asr before sunset, you're in time. If not, then you've prayed dhuhr in the asr time. Like if you've prayed dhuhr in asr, but then didn't catch at least 1 unit of asr before the sunset came in, you actually have missed both prayers. You've missed now both dhuhr and asr. So, it's kind of a package deal. There's the sort of laxity in the sense that you can still pray dhuhr in asr time, and it's considered to be on time, but, in relationship to the one who is waiting an extremely long time and then is unable to pray dhuhr in at least one rak'ah of asr before maghrib comes in, they've now lost both of those prayers. Okay. Now, the asr daruri starts at the isfirar, which is somewhat vague, again, because it depends on your location. And it's defined typically as the late afternoon yellowing. There's a change that occurs in the hue of the sun, in which there's a yellowing that occurs on the earth. You can see it oftentimes very apparently on like the walls of buildings. But again, these are not like uniform criteria for us to think about. But you can tell in the afternoon there's a change of light, right, where the tilt takes on a yellowing. I work a lot with lenses and cameras and whatnot. It's been a passion of mine for a very long time. So like these phenomena are actually very apparent for me. Anybody who works with lenses and cameras understands this. Everything is measured in Kelvin when you're dealing with light. And so, 3600 Kelvin or so, you are more or less accentuating the blue tones. And when you get up into like the, mid 5,000s, 6,000s, 7,000s, you're really now dealing with the yellowish tones, right? And so you can begin to sort of assess these things much more clearly when you're constantly dealing with light in that way. Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani rahimahullah ta'ala says that if you're looking straight ahead and you can see the orb of the sun, then the daruri of asr has come in. Now that's the implication of him living in Tunisia, right? It's not going to be the case, obviously, if you're in Alaska, which at that point you would always see the orb of the sun. So the criteria differs. That's the point. But, generally the time of asr is like, what is it now? Yeah, like it continues to get more and more apparent, right, as the sun descends. The color scheme gets a lot warmer. Okay, so from there the sun will continue descending, coming into golden hour. And again, this is sort of a term that photographers use. Many people understand it. Golden hour is like this time period where all of the photos happen. The light that the sun emits onto, the earth, wherever you are in the region that you're living, it really creates an amazing scenery around you. Like just, it's really phenomenal, subhanAllah, that you just see it and you just say subhanAllah. But, this is a time period that most people like to take pictures. It's about an hour before sunset until it drops then completely below the horizon. Now, when the sun is completely gone from the orb, it's maghrib. And the Prophet ﷺ said, when you see the night from here coming and the day from here leaving, right? إِذَا أَقْبَلَ اللَّيْلِ مِنْ هَا هُنَا قَدْ أَفْطَرَ الصَّائِمُ. So, إِقْبَالِ اللَّيْلِ, there's a line of darkness that you'll see on the eastern horizon. It's a grayish line on the eastern horizon, right? So, on the eastern horizon, there shouldn't be any color or tint to it. Like there shouldn't be any orange, right? If you can still see orange in the eastern horizon, it's not sunset. Now on the western horizon, you'll see the idbar, the coloring that comes. It's actually extremely beautiful. And these are the two discernible phenomena for the Maghrib. Now the sunset time, once you get into sunset, the sun has gone completely under the horizon line. You will then begin to see that there's a range of colors, right, that begin to then take place, and it increasingly will get darker and darker. So Maghrib, the time period for sunset, usually is quite short. Generally, Maghrib is considered to be either all dururi, and some of the scholars say from the shafaq up to just before the Fajr, in which you can pray one raka'ah of Isha, is the dururi of Maghrib. Right, so once the light reaches the shafaq al-ahmar, the red, when it disappears, it's a reddening in the sky. Okay, when that disappears, it's Isha, according to the Malikis. So Maghrib and Isha is similar to Dhuhr and Asr. And the dururi for Isha is at the end of the first third. This is the dominant opinion. There's another strong opinion that says it's at half of the night, at the half point of the night. Now the Fajr prayer from Malik is considered the Salat al-Wusta that is mentioned in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, be diligent or guard the middle prayer. And for Imam Malik, that was not Asr. And he knew all of the, scriptural sources for this. The dalil that was, in Bukhari that people point out. This was also, by the way, the opinion of Imam Ali and Ibn Abbas. Like the companions amongst those who, were around at Khaybar when they missed the prayer. They knew they missed it and what the Prophet ﷺ said. But again, that's Malik's philosophy. He draws from the Quranic times, and the Sunnah expounds on that and explains the details, including how many prayers are within those times and raka'at, etc. Now the Fajr comes in when the sun reaches 18 degrees below the horizon, which is where you first start to see the light, right? Some said it was 15 degrees. This kind of goes back and forth amongst our community at times. But, generally speaking, I go with 18 degrees. I don't really make a big point out of it, to be honest. I just have friends of mine that I know that went and actually, saw, they, did like calculations and took, I think it was like a weekend or two, and, actually went and saw for themselves what measuring everything, and they made charts and whatnot. And all of them said that, by 18 degrees, it was there. They were somewhat sort of like up in the air, but they said by 15 degrees it was definitely there, and it had already been there for a while, right? So, but this point then, where the sun reaches 18 degrees below the horizon, which is where you first start to see the light, okay? And that's why we have a bit of lag in terms of the solar, by the way, versus the lunar markings, because the sun takes 23 hours and 56 minutes on average. And so when you add up, 23 hours, 56 minutes over 3 years, it's an entire day, hence the leap year, right? So now there's also something called Fajr al-Kadhib, which is the lying Fajr, which it appears, you'll actually see the light. It's a phenomena, and you'll see a light. I was actually once in the desert traveling in Egypt. My uncle would oftentimes take us to go hunting in the desert. And you have to go with the Badu. You have to go with the Bedouins because they're the ones who help you navigate. If you do it on your own, you'll definitely die. It's very difficult. And these individuals were able to drive for very long periods of time away from the campsite that we were at in the middle of the night. There's no light outside of the light that we're casting from the car. And, we would drive for 2-3 hours, and somehow they were able to bring us back to our campsite. And his head would be out the window looking up at the stars to help him navigate what was, where he was. It's really incredible, subhanAllah. But, so they have a profound awareness of not just location, but like time and the date, like just simply by looking at the sky. Like they can tell you, what day of the month it is. Now, the point that I was making was that in the desert, you can see this phenomenon known as Fajr al-Kadhib, the lying Fajr, every morning. It's the false dawn, okay? And the false dawn is a light that comes up and it looks like dawn, but it's not. And, immediately that light will disappear. So you'll see it and you'll think it's Fajr. And, many people said that they prayed Fajr thinking that was Fajr, and then it went away and they weren't sure what happened. Now, one of the tells that they talk about to know whether or not this is true dawn or not is that the line is not a flat line. All right, so that's something to look out for. Now, when that light goes, you'll see on the horizon, if you're looking at the horizon, there's a very white light, okay, that's clear, and it should spread all the way across the horizon. And that white light increases quite fast. That's the beginning of the actual Fajr time. Now that period, which is quite dark, is the beginning of Subh prayer. Okay, so Fajr is the moment that the sun, we call it Fajr, even though the actual prayer itself in the madhhab is called Subh. We call it Fajr because the term itself is talking about the moment that the sun splits or cracks, right? You fajr shape, meaning like you crack something. And so they're talking about the moment that the sun cracks or splits with the horizon line. And you have that expression even in English, right? We say the crack of dawn. Right? So the Arabs also use this. So that part, it's the best part or time to pray the prayer in, right? The notion of al-khayt al-abyad is during this point. حتى يتبين الخيط الأبيض من الخيط الأسود, right? When you can distinguish the white thread from the black thread. Black thread is the thread above the white. Anyway, so the ikhtiyari and the daruri times for Fajr is a point of ikhtilaf. This is where we're on this diagram here, okay? Some of the ulama say until it reaches the shuruq, which is the sunrise, it's all mukhtar. That's one opinion. These are both strong opinions. Generally, in our time, you have about an hour and a half or so, maybe less. That's about how long from the first dawn until the sun rises. And it'll fluctuate, obviously, but generally it's going to be about an hour and a half. The second is at the point of isfar. Okay, so there's a point in that time period where you can begin to clearly distinguish things. You can discern, you see people's faces, you can clearly make out their faces, etc. So the second opinion is that it's from dawn to this isfar time, which is all ikhtiyari, and then from isfar to shuruq is dururi. And then the last opinion, which is the opinion that most Malikis follow, is that it's all dururi. That Fajr is not really, it doesn't actually have an ikhtiyari time, it's all dururi. So you should pray it as soon as you wake up. Like if the prayer is in, then the time that it takes you from the moment that you wake up to make wudu, pray your 2 rak'ahs of raghiba, the sunan, and we'll talk about that when we get to the nawafil prayers. And then get to the mosque and pray is, the amount of time, that's when you should pray it. So those are the opinions of the ikhtiyari and daruri of Fajr. All right. So I just wanted to go through that. I think it's very important for us to, discuss this at length. And if you have any questions, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we can take them at this point. We'll end here and get into the sunan next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions?